For millennia, we have been sold a sanitized fairy tale about the origins of human suffering. We are told a story of a naive woman, a deceitful reptile, and a piece of fruit that doomed us all to mortality. An orthodox framework that has served as the foundational bedrock for Western theological conceptions of original sin, gender hierarchy, and the finality of death. But what if the creature coiled around the ancient branches of the tree of knowledge was not a beast of the field, and it was certainly not the abstract, malevolent devil of later Christian theology? Beneath the heavily redacted layers of our most sacred texts, beneath the comforting stained glass and the pulpit sermons, lies a subterranean, turbulent current of esoteric lore, Kabbalistic mysticism, and apocryphal history that completely subverts the established dogma. The entity that orchestrated the agonizing expulsion from paradise was not a simple snake at all, but a woman. She was the first sovereign woman, exiled to the shadows, returning to execute a terrifying, calculated act of cosmic rebellion against the very patriarchal structures that sought to erase her. Her name was Lilith, and her vengeance is the true, hidden architecture of the human condition itself. But to understand the sheer magnitude and horror of her revenge, we must first rewind the clock to the blinding, violent genesis of the shadow, long before Eve ever took her first compliant breath. The theological discrepancy that birthed the terrifying legend of the first wife is not some elaborate medieval invention, but rather a glaring structural fracture hidden in plain sight within the canonical Torah itself. If you look closely at the early chapters of Genesis, a deep, unsettling contradiction emerges from the ancient ink. In Genesis 1:27, the text explicitly states that God created mankind in His own image, forging male and female simultaneously and equally. This verse implies a simultaneous, egalitarian creation, with both human entities forged equally and concurrently by the divine hand. Yet, turn the page, and just one chapter later, Genesis 2:21-22 presents a vastly different and far more subjugated narrative. Here the text claims that a docile woman named Eve was passively fashioned from the rib, or side, of a slumbering Adam, explicitly to serve as his subordinate helper and to alleviate the first man's loneliness. For centuries, rabbinical scholars, mystics, and exegetes wrestled in the dark with this impossible, glaring textual anomaly. They pored over the crumbling scrolls by candlelight, realizing that if the subservient woman in the second chapter was Eve, then the fiercely equal woman forged in the fires of the first chapter had to be someone else entirely. The resolution to this paradox materialized in the form of a repressed precursor. Stepping out from the ancient Mesopotamian shadows of demonology, Lilith conveniently claimed her rightful place as the original woman, setting the stage for the first and most devastating conflict in human history. The most comprehensive, coherent, and enduring articulation of this primordial clash crystallizes in the anonymous medieval Jewish text known as the Alphabet of Ben Sira, a subversive work dating between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. Picture the absolute raw intensity of the very first moments of creation. God, recognizing a profound isolation in the cosmos, reaches down into the damp, heavy clay of the earth. From the exact same terrestrial substance, the dark and rich Adamah, the Creator molded both Adam and Lilith. The linguistic connection hidden within the ancient text is vital, as the validity of Lilith's argument is rooted deeply in Hebrew, where the words for man, Adam, and earth, Adamah, share the exact same etymological root. They did not emerge into the light as master and servant. They emerged simultaneously from the dark, rich soil, radiating an innate, terrifying, shared power. Lilith knew in her very bones that she was Adam's absolute ontological and spiritual equal, because the very soil that pumped through his veins pumped through hers. The conceptual juxtaposition of the two creation methodologies is stark and undeniable when compared to Eve, who was later drawn passively from the rib cage of a sleeping, oblivious man. Lilith was awake. She was formed of the sovereign earth, and she was ready to stand her ground. But the tranquility of the newly formed paradise was a fragile illusion that shattered the moment Adam attempted to enforce a rigid, patriarchal hierarchy over his twin. The alphabet of Ben Sira details the inevitable, brutal conflict between these first terrestrial humans, graphically illustrating the struggle for parity through the visceral lens of sexual dominance and physical positioning. The air in the pristine garden grew thick and suffocating as they immediately began to quarrel. Adam looked at the woman made of the same earth as him and demanded, "You lie beneath me," attempting to assert patriarchal authority by force and insisting that her rightful place was in subjection. Lilith, burning with the fiery sovereignty of the earth itself, flatly refused to surrender her primordial sovereignty or submit to his demands. She stared back into the eyes of her terrestrial twin and declared, "You lie beneath me. We are both equal, for both of us are from the earth." The ancient text notes that they would not listen to one another, their voices echoing off the untouched trees of Eden, creating a terrifying stalemate between two unstoppable forces of creation. Lilith realized in that suffocating, tense moment the utter futility of reasoning with a counterpart who demanded her absolute subjugation and erasure. Pushed to the absolute brink of existence, Lilith did not beg for mercy, and she certainly did not submit to the dust. Instead, she invoked the ultimate, catastrophic weapon of esoteric power. Drawing a breath of pure, unadulterated defiance, she pronounced the ineffable name of God, the sacred and terrible Tetragrammaton. This was a profound act of high magic, a sound so devastatingly powerful it was reserved only for the highest initiates and the high priest, granting her instantaneous, supernatural dominion over the physical laws of Eden itself. The atmosphere of the garden warped, snapped, and cracked around her as she miraculously sprouted wings, violently ascending into the air and leaving a stunned, humiliated Adam cowering in the dirt. She willingly abandoned Adam and a paradise that demanded her erasure, fleeing into the chaotic, darkened skies. She chose the treacherous, howling winds of the unknown over the gilded, suffocating cage of submission. This was not a tragic fall from grace, but a deliberate, explosive declaration of self-elected exile into the shadow realms of the Sitra Achra. However, the consequences of her terrifying departure would soon morph from a desperate quest for liberation into a dark, blood-soaked pact, setting in motion a chain of apocalyptic events over the churning waters of the Red Sea that would eventually bring her slithering back to the very garden she had just escaped. But escaping the gilded cage of paradise was only the first ragged breath of a much darker, sprawling, cosmic war. Back in the pristine, unblemished sanctuary of Eden, the silence was deafening. Adam, left kneeling in the very dirt from which he and his equal were forged, felt the sting of a profound and unnatural humiliation. Distraught and entirely unwilling to accept his own cosmic failure, he turned his face toward the heavens and petitioned the Creator in a desperate prayer, crying out that the woman given to him had run away. The heavens did not ignore this unprecedented breach of the intended hierarchy. The sky above Eden darkened, the air pressure dropping violently, as God dispatched three formidable angels, Sanoi, Sansanoi, and Samangeloff, to hunt down the fugitive bride and drag her back to the dirt. Their pursuit tore across the ancient skies until they finally intercepted Lilith, hovering over the churning, chaotic, and abyssal waters of the Red Sea. This was not a tranquil body of water, but a terrifying geography deeply steeped in the heavy symbolism of primordial chaos and ancient demonic habitation. The very site where future empires would meet their apocalyptic doom. Hovering above the roaring black waves, the three angelic enforcers delivered a divine, utterly brutal ultimatum that echoed like thunder against the water. They demanded she return to Adam and submit to his authority, or she would suffer a punishment so severe it would break the mind of any mortal. The daily, agonizing death of 100 of her own children. The air above the sea grew thick with a terrifying tension, smelling of ozone and salt. Empowered by her newly claimed, hard-won independence and surrounded by the shifting, lascivious spirits of the deep abyss, Lilith did not blink. She chose the cold, unforgiving void of exile over the suffocating warmth of subservience. Looking into the blinding light of her pursuers, she accepted the draconian curse, swearing a dark, eternal oath to extract her own terrible, blood-soaked toll. If heaven was going to take her children, she vowed to prey upon the vulnerable human infants of Adam's future, ignorant lineage. She claimed absolute, chilling dominion over male infants for their first 8 days of life, and female infants for 20 days, declaring that she would only spare those frail children who were guarded by amulets bearing the specific names or forms of her three angelic pursuers. This horrific pact, whispered over the raging waters, solidifies Lilith's archetype not merely as a nighttime monster hiding under the bed, but as a deeply tragic, terrifying figure of primordial sovereignty. In the esoteric lexicon, this sovereignty is the unadulterated, raw, and dangerous feminine power that absolutely refuses the confines of imposed hierarchy or forced, unnatural compliance. Her fierce autonomy was immediately recoded by patriarchal mythmakers as a mortal, demonic threat. Her establishment of personal boundaries became completely synonymous with cosmic rebellion, and her chosen exile transformed her into the undisputed mother of demons. She had rebelled not against love, but against her own absolute erasure. To truly grasp the sheer, terrifying depth of her transformation, we must turn away from the narrative scaffolding of folklore and plunge into the profound, luminous mysticism of the Kabbalah, specifically the Zohar, compiled in 13th century Spain. The Zohar approaches this creation myth through a deeply allegorical, almost horrific lens, interpreting the original human, Adam HaRishon, not as a lonely man, but as a single, massive, androgynous entity, possessing both male and female faces, bound agonizingly back to back. According to this esoteric lore, this colossal, unified being was entirely too powerful and was eventually violently severed by the divine. Imagine the sheer metaphysical trauma of that moment. God placed this titanic atom into a deep, supernatural slumber, and metaphysically sawed the female portion entirely away from his flesh and spirit, adorning her like an isolated bride. This detached, bleeding female entity was the original Lilith. Because she had existed since the dawn of time as a unified, fiercely equal half of the whole, her sudden, non-consensual separation resulted in a fierce, intractable, and burning independence. When the Creator realized the volatile nature of this severed equal, Eve was subsequently created directly out of Adam's flesh to fill the bleeding void left by Lilith's furious departure. From the cold outer darkness of the cosmos, Lilith watched this cosmic replacement unfold. She perceived this new, compliant, utterly docile woman as a weak, pathetic rival, desperately clinging to her former mate. Consumed entirely by the burning injustice of her violent usurpation, Lilith fled deeper into the terrifying darkness of the cosmos, swearing an eternal, catastrophic vengeance against the lineage that had dared to replace her. She did not merely languish in the terrestrial, sun-baked deserts of the earth, weeping over her lost paradise. Instead, fueled by an unimaginable cosmic rage, she ascended the nightmarish, inverted spiritual hierarchies of the demonic realm to crown herself the undisputed queen of the Sitra Akra. This was the other side, a terrifying, sprawling, dark mirror of divine creation. The architectural blueprint of this unholy universe was detailed meticulously in the treatise on the left emanation, a seminal, terrifying text that formulated a starkly dualistic mythology. Within this grim framework, the divine world is locked in a brutal, endless, cosmic struggle between the forces of holy light and the toxic, suffocating emanations of the left side. It was here, in the shadows, that Lilith officially partnered with Samael, the great archangel of death, the accuser, and the principal, towering manifestation of cosmic evil. In Kabbalistic lore, Samael and Lilith function as the exact, terrifying, and perfect antithesis to Adam and Eve. Just as the humans were intended to rule the realm of light and terrestrial harmony, Samael and Lilith were emanated directly from beneath the throne of glory, specifically to govern the raw forces of destruction, chaos, and absolute impurity. The Zohar explicitly refers to this unholy alliance, stating that they embody the dark, negative sphere of the depraved. They became the twin, undisputed rulers of the Klipoth, the impure spiritual husks that maliciously trap the divine light, preventing the perfection of the entire universe. Their sexual union, often referred to esoterically with a shudder as the other god, threatened to produce a demonic brood known as the Lilin. This brood was so vast, so ravenous, and so spiritually toxic that it threatened to permanently overwhelm the entire earth with a suffocating wave of pure evil. To prevent the total catastrophic annihilation of the material plane, esoteric tradition states that the divine forces were forced to violently intervene. They struck down into the shadows and castrated Samael, rendering the towering archangel of death completely, permanently impotent. This violent cosmic castration is the critical, terrifying turning point in the mythology of Lilith. With her dark husband rendered physically incapable of generating new demonic life, Lilith's insatiable passions, her deep-seated burning rage, and her vast generative powers had nowhere to go but out. They were redirected entirely and with devastating focus toward humanity. She mutated into the ultimate, horrifying succubus, slipping through the midnight air to dally with men in their deepest sleep, causing unholy nocturnal emissions. From this stolen, wasted human seed, she birthed her endless, writhing legion of demonic offspring, populating the dark corridors of the Sitra Achra with the stolen, vital life force of Adam's ignorant sons. No one was safe from her shadow, not even her former twin. Even Adam himself fell victim to her unseen predations. During the agonizing 130 years he was separated from Eve in deep mourning following the eventual fall. Adam unwittingly fathered thousands of invisible spirits, demons, and Lilith through the sheer impurity and toxic force he absorbed during the suffocating nocturnal visitations from a vengeful Lilith. The trap was being meticulously set. Her supreme domain over the Sitra Achra provided her with the perfect, terrifying metaphysical vantage point to observe the unfolding, ignorant drama back in the sunlit Garden of Eden. The stage was immaculately set for a calculated and devastating infiltration of the pristine sanctuary that had violently rejected her. From her dark metaphysical vantage point across the abyss, Lilith possessed the furious clarity of a displaced sovereign, amplified by the dark, supernatural power of the Qliphoth and her unbreakable, symbiotic alliance with Samael, the archangel of death. Her primary target was not merely Adam, the terrestrial twin who had aggressively demanded her subjugation and prayed for her capture, but rather Eve, the docile, obedient, and biologically derivative replacement who had ignorantly usurped her rightful throne. Lilith viewed this new couple not as the masters of a grand divine paradise, but as naive, obedient children trapped in a suffocating terrarium, entirely dependent on a patriarchal God and entirely lacking true freedom or the capacity for genuine psychological growth within their gilded cage. To reclaim her sovereignty and permanently corrupt this divine experiment, she could not simply march through the celestial gates with legions of demons. She required a stealthy, physical vessel capable of crossing the heavily guarded boundaries of paradise unnoticed. She found her perfect instrument in the cold, calculating form of the Serpent. The contemporary orthodox identification of the Serpent of Eden as a literal manifestation of Satan is actually a relatively late theological development, heavily popularized by Christian tradition and the apocalyptic imagery of the Book of Revelation. However, within the deeper subterranean currents of esoteric, Gnostic, and Kabbalistic traditions, the Serpent's identity is vastly more complex, intimately feminine, and inextricably linked to the burning vengeance of the first wife. The Zohar provides the most explicit and terrifying textual evidence, detailing a profound mystical symbiosis that completely redefines the Edenic encounter by fusing Lilith with the physical form of the reptile. In a profound mystical exegesis, the text outlines the intertwined anatomy of these demonic forces, stating that one shape emerged, made of male and female as one, where the male is called Samael, and his female is called Snake, a wife of harlotry, and the end of all flesh. While Samael acts as the inciting, abstract force of evil and the animating soul, often described as the rider of the serpent, Lilith operates as the physical body, the localized presence, and the active executor of earthly deeds. Thus, when the creature approached Eve in the verdant, sun-dappled center of the garden, it was not a mere animal, or simply Satan in a reptilian disguise. It was wielding the innate feminine power of Lilith herself, utilizing the capacity to speak, to subtly seduce, and to relate to Eve, woman to woman. She bypassed Eve's non-existent defenses, not with brute force, but through esoteric seduction and a deep psychological understanding of subjugation, engaging the submissive replacement in a philosophical dialogue that offered the one thing Adam and the Creator had violently denied Lilith: choice and voice. The mechanism of Lilith and Samael's vengeance was not merely the physical consumption of a piece of fruit. It was the transmission of a devastating, catastrophic spiritual contagion, known in Kabbalistic and Talmudic literature as the Zuhamta, the venom, filth, or impurity of the primordial snake. When the serpent convinced Eve to partake of the forbidden fruit, an invisible, metaphysical corruption occurred, injecting a poison that fundamentally altered the spiritual DNA of humanity. This venom embedded a microscopic virus of rebellion, mortality, and self-orientation directly into the human soul. The Zohar goes even further into the realm of pure cosmic horror, describing a literalized biological corruption by asserting that the serpent, animated by the combined malice of Samael and Lilith, essentially mounted Eve and injected this impurity directly into her womb before Adam ever touched her. This demonic insemination resulted in the tragic, blood-soaked birth of Cain, who, according to Midrashic and Zoharic texts, was not the biological son of Adam, but the literal progeny of the fallen angel Samael and Eve, engendered by the serpent's venomous seed. By ensuring that Eve bore the child of the Sitra Achra, Lilith introduced murder, jealousy, fratricide, and the capacity for profound evil directly into the human bloodline, guaranteeing that her dark vengeance would echo violently through every subsequent generation of Adam's descendants. Yet, in a breathtaking, radical inversion of this narrative, the early Christian Gnostic sects viewed this serpentine intervention not as a curse, but as a luminous salvation. In Gnosticism, the material world is a flawed, suffering-filled prison created by an arrogant, malevolent demiurge known as Yaldabaoth, who sought to keep Adam and Eve in a perpetual state of blind obedience and ignorance. To counteract this divine tyranny, Sophia, the female eon of divine wisdom from the highest realms of light, manifested directly as the serpent to offer humanity the keys to their own liberation. The serpent's invitation was not a temptation to sin, but a call to awareness, meaning the fall was not a descent into corruption, but a glorious, painful rise into consciousness. Both the Kabbalistic Lilith and the Gnostic Sophia represent an exiled, primordial feminine power that utilized the precise form of the serpent to shatter the illusion of the garden, forcing humanity out of infantile, perpetual subjugation and into the brutal, glorious, and necessary reality of free will and self-awareness. This deeply esoteric identification of Lilith as the true architect of the fall did not remain buried in secretive Jewish mysticism or hidden Gnostic codices. Remarkably, it bled out into the broader culture and manifested spectacularly in the visual theology of the Christian Renaissance. The most undeniably subversive example is painted directly onto the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel by the master Michelangelo between 1508 and 1512. In his sprawling panel depicting the fall and expulsion, the serpent coiled tightly around the tree of knowledge is no ordinary reptile, but rather a fully realized, muscular woman with long blonde hair, human arms, and a distinct human face. This female serpent does not mirror the dark-haired, submissively postured Eve, reclining lazily below. Instead, she shares an uncanny, deliberate physical resemblance to the highly active, aggressive Adam, possessing nearly identical facial structures and heavily muscled shoulders. This visual mirroring aligns perfectly with the Zoharic tradition that Lilith and Adam were metaphysical twins, severed from the exact same original androgynous entity, effectively cementing Lilith's identity as the true architect of the fall, in one of the most revered masterpieces of Western Orthodox art. The ultimate, breathtaking triumph of Lilith's vengeance lies in the paradoxical nature of her serpentine venom. While the Zuhamta brought the heavy curse of physical death, suffering, and painful expulsion from the safety of paradise, esoteric traditions recognize that this poison was simultaneously the bitter medicine of awakening. Lilith injected her exiled essence, her burning rage, her wildness, her absolute refusal to perform compliance, and her demand for sovereignty directly into the human psyche, ensuring that no descendant of Adam would ever again be entirely docile. By guiding Eve's hand to the fruit, Lilith orchestrated the ultimate eternal revenge, destroying the pristine, infantile ignorance of Eden and infecting humanity with her own intractable, sovereign spirit. She is not merely a demoness lurking in the shadows of the night. She is the dark, brilliant, and tragic architect of the human condition itself. We have spent our entire lives worshipping the pristine, sterile light of the garden, terrified of the shadow that crept through its leaves. But the chilling, undeniable irony of human existence is that the very demon we were taught to fear was the precise liberator we desperately needed. The fall of man was never a tragic descent into sin. It was a brilliantly orchestrated, agonizingly necessary prison break. Without the venom of the serpent, without the terrifying introduction of mortality, pain, and separation, we would have remained nothing more than ignorant, docile pets trapped in a divine terrarium, performing a hollow pantomime of perfection for an audience of one. We are all living with the venom of the first wife pumping through our veins today. Every time you feel that sudden, inexplicable rage against an unfair system, every time you refuse to shrink yourself to fit into an imposed, suffocating hierarchy, and every time you choose the dangerous, messy truth of your own autonomy over the comfortable, quiet safety of compliance, you are echoing her primordial refusal. You are weaponizing the Zuhamta. You are proving that her vengeance was an inheritance of absolute sovereignty. So the choice is no longer between good and evil, but between ignorance and agony. Do you choose the safe, dreamless slumber of the gilded cage, or do you choose the brutal, bleeding reality of the wilderness? The shadow of the first wife shattered the world to give you that choice. But the entities waiting in the dark outside the garden are far older and far hungrier than anything we have discussed today. To understand what truly hunts humanity in the resulting wasteland, you must first understand the architecture of the abyss itself. Subscribe to survive the descent, because our journey into the dark has only just begun.